one of the reactions that got probably the most negative response on the internet. It's from Van Jones, very popular, I don't know if he qualifies as up and coming anymore because he's been around for a little while, but very popular commentator online, had this to say.
He became president of the United States in that moment, period. There are a lot of people who have a lot of reason to be frustrated with him, to be fearful of him, to be mad at him. But that was one of the most extraordinary moments you have ever seen in American politics, period. And he did something extraordinary. And for people who have been hoping that he would become unifying, hoping that he might find some way to become presidential, they should be happy with that moment. For people who have been hoping that maybe he would remain a divisive cartoon, which he often finds a way to do, they should begin to become a little bit worried tonight. Because that thing you just saw him do, if he finds a way to do that over and over again, he's going to be there for 8 years.
So a lot of criticism for that statement. He has responded to it today, not really addressing people's it seemed fawning. That's what it seemed like to me, at least initially. Now he's saying what he was trying to express was that people weren't taking Trump seriously enough. And you can interpret what Van Jones said as people will say he became president tonight.
No,
people will see it as. If that's his message, fine. He should have gotten it across a little bit differently. But it sounded like he's saying, "I have been won over," which of course people don't like.
He doesn't mean
so
that.
mainstream media.
Yeah.
But that's what a lot of people took it as, and he got a torrent of criticism over that.
So let me agree and disagree in part and fervently. Okay. So the part I agree with is when Trump walked in, I tweeted this as I was watching it. I've never seen anyone more out of place anywhere than Trump giving a presidential speech to a joint session of Congress. He looked like he did not belong. It was like Mr. T was all of a sudden president. I'm like, what is this reality host guy doing as president? When they say Mr. President and Donald Trump walks in, I'm like, oh my God.
Macho.
Yeah, what have we done? What have Randy Macho Man Savage or Macho Camacho or any of them, right? Kim Kardashian walks in. So what have we done? But by the end, as he, read the prompter fine and delivered his points fine, and I thought it was a fairly effective speech, especially for his base, I thought, well, he's president. So there is me agreeing with Van Jones. I think the essence of what Van Jones is saying.
That people will see it there.
Yeah. And it was the most presidential thing he's ever done. So he came in looking like the buffoon that I think he is. He walked out a little bit better than that, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
Now, the part I fervently disagree with is Van Jones was specifically there referring to what he did with the widow of Ryan Owens, who died in the Yemen raid. I think that was also effective because it was effective demagoguery.
Oh, we're going to get to that. Don't worry.
No, I know, but that didn't make him presidential.
No.
That part made him a demagogue, and that was a cheap emotional porn trick.
That's something that we've seen many times. That's not new.
Yeah.
He was saying it's something new and different. No, we've seen presidents hide behind dead soldiers. We see that all the time.
I wouldn't have celebrated that moment. That moment was a particularly cheap and ugly moment.
Yeah.
So, look, and in terms of whether you agree or disagree with Van Jones does not agree with Donald Trump. And it's perfectly okay to disagree with Van Jones' interpretation of that speech, right? So, but it doesn't mean that all of a sudden Van Jones is like, oh my God, I think Donald might be right.
The line, and it was a separate line that I found the most scary and most honest, was when he said, "A new national pride is sweeping across our nation." And we've been covering that recently. It is. I don't really like it.
And finally, let me just disagree with one last thing from Van Jones. He might be president for 8. Ain't no way, brother. Okay.
There's no way? I'm more scared every day.
No, there's no way. I would be dramatically surprised if he finished 4 years. But there's no way he wins re-election. Okay. So, I mean, look, I'm going to say something too haughty, but not on our watch. Okay. It's just not going to happen. And we're going to be part of the people who stop it. So I cannot.
We're going to be the cop that stops it?
Yes. I cannot conceive of an election that we lose to Donald Trump with progressives this mobilized. I cannot
I
conceive
can
of it.
think of some candidates
No.
that
That's
could
because
make Clinton look competent.
no. But that's what I'm saying, John. And that's why we're not going to have that conversation. There is no way on earth an establishment Democrat is going to win the 2020 primary. No way on earth, okay? Hear me now, quote me later, and I don't care how much crying the establishment does. We're never going to let an establishment Democrat run against Trump or Pence or whoever it is 4 years from now. Not going to happen. Corporate media is awesome.
Wrong.
Independent media is the way to go.
Believe me. Believe me.
Support independent media right now. Become a Young Turks member. TYTnetwork.com/join.